Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started at 7:30 now. We've got about half our participants, but I'm sure people will keep coming. So thank you so much. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to give something back to all of you who have done so much to support the Explorer, especially during our year-end campaign. Because of you, we're able to cover topics so important to the Adirondacks, like climate change and its effects on our rural communities and ecosystems. And the Adirondack Explorer has the only full-time climate reporter dedicated to this region. So if you're able to provide an additional gift for our climate reporting, we'd certainly welcome it. It will help us start our fiscal year in an even stronger position. So thank you so much again. A couple of program notes. It looks like the chat is disabled, and unless somebody can go into the Q&A and tell me how to fix that, I think we're going to have to stick with the Q&A for our comments and questions. So if you want to just put your questions in there while, throughout the evening here, we'll try and get to as many of those as we can. I'll read them and ask them of Bill, and he can answer them. But tonight you're here looking for some hope, some light, and expert insight. And even with the huge challenges of climate change, Bill McKibben has a way of offering all of that. You could say he wrote the book on climate change because he did. His book, The End of Nature, in 1988 was the first to address global warming for a general audience. And he's written many books, articles, and newsletters on the topic since, helping us all to understand how serious this issue is and what we can all do. He helped to form 350.org with his students, the first global grassroots climate campaign, and more recently, Third Act, to organize people over 60 around climate action. He's led a years-long successful campaign of fossil fuel divestment. And we're going to hear a lot of the opposite of Bill's message in the next 4 years, but we can count on him to remind us of the facts. Renewable energy is now cheaper to produce than coal and gas. And if we continue to rely on fossil fuels, our planet will get hotter and more dangerous. So please join me in welcoming one of America's leading climate activists, a friend of the Adirondack Explorer, of the Adirondacks and cold winters, Bill McKibben.
Well, Tracy, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be with everybody. I'm joining you tonight from just across the lake in Addison County, Vermont. I'm assuming that it's as beautiful there today as it was here. It was an absolute snow globe kind of day. And it comes after one of the best stretches of winter weather I can remember, the best in many years. My advice would be, don't take it for granted. Use every minute of it, because this is the kind of thing that's now rarer and rarer on our planet and in our region, as all of you know. We're very lucky. January 2025 is going to be the warmest January on record around the planet. It's just that all our small corner of that planet has benefited from a kind of stuck jet stream that's kept us in this beautiful place. I know I've been out trying to take as much pleasure as I can from it, in part because it's been such a hideous stretch of time otherwise. And I'm not even really sure that we should be sitting here talking about climate and energy tonight. We're in the middle of what feels like a fairly fast-moving authoritarian takeover of the democracy that we've had in this country for 243 years. And a Third Act, we're doing what we can to stop that. Third Act is for old people like me. And we've been, yesterday, we're generating tens of thousands of phone calls and things in to try and stop this freezing of federal funds and the other. That said, there are also big, powerful, long-term trends happening on this planet that probably in the end are as important as the political weather that we're enduring now. So I'm going to talk about both those things and the way that they overlap and where the possibilities lie. And I'll plan to talk for about half an hour, and then we'll stop and see if there are any questions. And then you can all go ski with the headlamp on or whatever if you don't want to talk anymore. First thing is, let's just situate ourselves where we are as we start the second half of this decade. In terms of climate, we've just come through back to back the two hottest years ever recorded on our planet. And they were the hottest by a pretty large margin. The fairly steady ramp up in temperatures, really since I wrote that book back in the late 1980s, turned into a quite abrupt spike beginning about the middle of 2023. We're able to take the daily average temperature of the planet. We have enough weather buoys and satellites and meteorological stations that we can average out the temperature every day around the Earth and give a number. And that number really spiked for the first time in late June, early July of 2023. The world is always hottest on average at the solstice in the Northern Hemisphere because there's more land mass here. And those days were the hottest days scientists told us that they'd ever measured. Our measurements go back a couple hundred years, but scientists are good at building proxy records that go back much, much further. Glacial sediments, lake cores. Talk to Kurt Steger if you want more detail. Tree rings. And what people were saying with great confidence was that these were the hottest days in at least the last 125,000 years. For context, that's about the point when anthropologists think that humans started etching symbols on bone. Nothing that resembles any civilization we'd understand has ever lived on as hot a planet as this. And since June of 2023, it's just gotten hotter. Pretty much every month that's happened in the last 18 months has been the hottest of its kind ever. And we've just broken one record after another. It's really quite remarkable to see what's been happening in the temperature record, and quite remarkable and quite tragic to see what that's meant in real time on the surface of the planet. Just to refresh your memory, if you wanted one way to understand the 21st century, you could do worse than warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That means in arid areas, we get more evaporation, then more drought. And when it's hot enough, we inevitably get fire. The most recent example, of course, is the hideously painful conflagration that's engulfed Los Angeles this month. The house that I lived in as a boy, where my earliest childhood memories are in Altadena, burned down a couple of weeks ago. And the effects of those fires are extraordinary. It's probably going to be, in dollar terms, the single biggest disaster in American history. It looks like it may top Katrina for that honor. But of course, those fires are not the only ones, and in certain ways, not the most devastating. You'll recall the summer of 2023. We spent many weeks in this part of the world breathing the smoke that was pouring down from the massive wildfires in the boreal forests of Canada. Those fires were so extensive that in 2023, Canada, with a population of 20 million people, became the fifth largest carbon emitting nation on Earth, trailing only China and India and the US and Indonesia, because so much carbon was pouring into the atmosphere from those fires. That's a vicious feedback loop. And I would add in passing that though we confidently refer to the Adirondacks as the asbestos forest and think that it won't ever burn because it's so moist and so on. That's probably a bad assumption. The boreal forest of Canada had never burned like this, nothing like it before. And it's probably only a matter of time before we hit stretches that are hot and dry enough that we have some of the same troubles. I've fought relatively small forest fires in the Adirondacks, and I can tell you it is not something we'd ever want to see because, man, is it hard to put them out in that duff that marks our region. Anyway, once that water has evaporated up into the atmosphere, it's going to come down. And it increasingly comes down in deluge and flood. In wet parts of the world like ours, that's our more common complaint. Here in Vermont, of course, we've had 2 summers of some of the most epic flooding that we've ever experienced. And some of that's been shared over into the park as well. But again, compared to what's happening in other parts of the world, our fate has been relatively mild. In the fall of 2023, after the flooding stopped here in Vermont, the next big set of rainstorms on the planet were in North Africa. And in Libya, the deluge was so horrific that a river washed out 2 dams and then roared into a coastal city and swept 10,000 people out to sea, where they drowned in the course of an hour. Bodies were washing up 150 kilometers away down the coastline. That's particularly sad because all of Africa has only produced about 3% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, compared to something like 25% from the 3% of the world's population that calls itself American. So they are paying for our carbon in lots and lots of ways. The bad news in all of this is that this is what happens when you increase the temperature of the Earth about 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's what we've done so far. And we're on a trajectory at the moment to raise the temperature about 3 degrees Celsius before this century is out, well before this century is out. And if that happens, then I think it's safe to say we won't have civilizations like the ones we've grown used to. Among other things, the UN estimates that that's enough to produce somewhere between 1 billion and 3 billion climate refugees who simply will have to leave because their homes will be underwater or will have burned down, or it'll be too hot to live and grow food in the places where they were born. Look, I think it's fair to say that 1 million or 2 refugees on our southern border were enough to discombobulate our politics and turn it in part into the ugly mess it has become. Multiply that by 1,000 and then try to imagine what kind of world we inhabit. And that's before we talk about the effects on agriculture or anything else of that kind of rise in temperature. Suffice it to say that our job is to do, and it's the most important job humans have yet undertaken, is to do everything that we can to prevent that from happening. Not to stop global warming, it's too late for that, to stop it short of the place where it cuts off civilizations at the knees. And that job, of course, seems incredibly dauntingly hard right now. It was hard already, but with the advent of a president who believes that climate change is a hoax and who has already announced plans to cancel every possible thing that he can, that our government has done to take it on, it's going to be a tremendous, tremendous challenge, especially because to have any hope of getting it done, it has to happen fast. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us that to stay on anything like the Paris pathway that we agreed to 8 years ago, we'd need to cut emissions in half around the world by 2030, which by my watch is 4 years and 11 months away. That does not give us a lot of time. All right. I'm going to pause there for a minute because that's the really hard part of all of this. And I will take a breath, and you can do likewise, and we will move on to talk about what we're going to try and do about it. And there, oddly, the news is not as bad as it would have been even a year or two ago. At precisely the same time that the planet's climate has been deteriorating, as if in some Hollywood saga, we've started to see the outlines of the one real possible salvation. Again, not salvation from global warming, but the possibility of tempering it to some kind of survivable degree. And that salvation comes in the form of the dramatic fall in the price of renewable energy, energy from the sun and the wind, and the batteries to store that energy. The cost of those things has fallen about 90% in the last 15 years. Sometime in the last 3 or 4 years, they went across some invisible line that made them less expensive to use for producing power than coal and gas and oil, the standbys of the last 200 years, and the things that are causing this rise in temperature. We now live on a planet where the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That's a remarkable shift, and it should give us some hope. And indeed, in some parts of the world, we're really seeing it begin to be put to use. I told you that it was June of 2023 when we had the highest temperatures we've had in 125,000 years. It was also June of 2023 when, for the first time, humans passed the line of installing more than a gigawatt of solar panels a day on this planet. A gigawatt's the rough equivalent of a nuclear power plant. So beginning in that month, we were putting up a nuclear power plant's worth of photovoltaic panels every day. That's increased now to the point where that's happening roughly every 18 hours. Now I say we, but more than half of that is happening in China, which has been the clear leader in taking on this crisis and building the technologies that we need to get us out of it. But that still leaves a fair amount happening in the rest of the world. And we can begin to see real possibilities in the places that have taken it seriously. California is the best example in this country. They've had the politics to support putting up a lot of solar panels and a lot of batteries. And beginning in 2024, it passed some kind of tipping point. For most days, at least since last March, California was producing more than 100% of the electricity that it used for long stretches of the day from sun and wind and water. At night, when the sun went down, batteries that had been soaking up excess sunshine all afternoon often became the largest source of supply to the grid. And the result of all that was that in 2024, California used 25% less natural gas to generate electricity than it had in 2023. Its use of gas, fossil fuel, to generate electricity dropped 25% in 1 year. That's the 5th largest economy in the world, and that gives one some sense of the possibilities. That's a big enough number that around the world it would be enough for it to happen to begin to take a serious bite out of that 3 degrees Celsius that we're otherwise aiming for. And it's not just California. Texas, red state, is now putting up clean energy faster than any other place in this country. The most inspiring story from last year was probably in Pakistan, a country that's been ravaged by heat and flood, but is lucky only in that it borders China. And so there was a sort of steady export of cheap Chinese solar panels across that border. And individual Pakistanis, without help from the government, were putting up an extraordinary number of them. In the course of the last 12 months, Pakistanis have put up the equivalent of half of their national electric grid just in solar panels on roofs of homes and factories and stores and whatnot. That's extraordinary. Farmers have been among the biggest adopters. Those of you who've traveled in rural Asia know that the sound of a diesel generator running a tube well for irrigation is the kind of backdrop hum of that peasant agriculture. But that diesel's a big cost. And so farmers were early adopters here. They often lack the money to put up the steel supports for a solar panel, so they've just been laying them on the ground. But Pakistan last year used 35% less diesel than it did the year before. That's an extraordinary number. Our job then is to figure out how to make those kind of numbers happen everywhere and fast. And so that's what I want to talk about today. We're not going to be able to depend on the federal government. Joe Biden did a remarkable thing in getting the Inflation Reduction Act with some serious money for renewables. We're going to try and defend as much of it as we can, but I think it's pretty clear that the Trump administration is going to legally and illegally do everything they can to block any more of that money from going out. We shall see. But that doesn't mean that there isn't lots that we can do, especially in blue states like New York, which is the 10th largest economy in the world and able to exert extraordinary power here too. At the moment, we're not blessed with a very bold governor on any of these things, and many of the plans have languished. But it was good to see Governor Hochul finally sign the Polluter Pays Climate Superfund bill in late December. And great gratitude to all my colleagues at Third Act, upstate New York, extremely active chapter led by Michael Richardson and others who played a huge role in making that happen. What we need to do now, I think, is build big popular support for clean energy fast. And that means in some ways going back to basics. I've been telling you a set of facts about where we stand now, but I don't think most people know those. We still talk about sun and wind as if they were alternative energy, as if they were kind of the Whole Foods of energy, nice but pricey. They're not. They're the Costco of energy. They're the stuff that's cheap, available in bulk, and off the shelf. And getting that message across is going to be crucial to determining the political dynamics in the years ahead. And I think the hardest place to do it's going to be, for obvious reasons, in the United States. Most of the rest of the world is beginning to take this turn in a serious direction. That's why we're, though we haven't publicly announced it yet, getting ready to do a big global day of action that'll fall on the autumnal equinox, September 20th and 21st of this year. And we're going to call it not Earth Day, but Sun Day. And it's going to be devoted to the idea that it is time in every jurisdiction to move in this direction and aggressively to build wind turbines and solar farms, to allow people in their homes to much more easily put up those panels. You know, it costs 3 times as much for an American to put solar power on the roof than it does for an Australian or a European. And almost all of that is down to the bureaucracy, the cumbersome system of building permits and things that we insist on, even though this is not a dangerous technology. So we're going to do lots and lots of things, and we need you to help. There will be parades of e-bikes and EVs, and there'll be people putting up solar panels and giving tours of their homes with heat pumps so that others can see them. And we're going to have people who already have solar power on their roofs turning on green lights at night to mark the fact that they're part of this revolution, and on and on and on. And lots more. Keep tuned. If nowhere else, you'll find word at Third Act or at this free newsletter that I put out called The Crucial Years. But we think this will be big. We have experience putting on huge events in the past at 350.org, which I've founded. We've organized demonstrations in probably 20,000 altogether in every country on earth except North Korea. So I think this will be fun and beautiful. And I hope that one of the things it will do is prompt those of us who are affluent, white Americans, the kind of people who are really good at stopping things from happening. I hope it'll help us change our aesthetic a little bit and develop more of a sense of responsibility. And that includes in the park. I got to say, came early to this thinking probably 20 some years ago when they first proposed a series of wind turbines up at up at the old Barton mine on the edge of the Siamese Ponds wilderness. I lived for much of my life in Johnsburg, and I know that wilderness as well as just about anybody on the planet. It's a place I've hiked and loafed and skied my whole life, and I love it. And so some part of me wished that there weren't going to be wind turbines visible on the border. And when you looked up from the, beaver flows along the Sacandaga, you wouldn't be able to see a wind turbine in the distance. But a deeper part of me understood that the real threat to that place was the fact that, winter was going to start to disappear as it has, that it was going to get dry and hot, and that if we couldn't do this kind of development, that's what would happen. So I wrote an editorial for the New York Times urging that we adopt it. Cost me a few friends. The Adirondack Council and other conservationists came out strong against it, and they won. And those turbines aren't there, just like that battery isn't in Racket Lake, because people prioritized their own small fears about what might happen there in some kind of extreme and unlikely event, prioritized that and didn't pay attention to the things that are happening every day in the poorest and most vulnerable communities in this country and on this earth. We're extraordinarily lucky to get to live in places like this. And our job is to defend those places when they're under real assault, and the planet on which they exist. We're not going to have a nice Johnsburg, a beautiful Siamese Ponds wilderness, a remarkable Racket Lake, or Moose River Plains, if we don't have a working planet. And it's our job and it's everyone's job to make sure that happens. Those of us who live in this part of the world have been pouring carbon into the atmosphere for centuries. We will never catch up with the size of our carbon debt, but we should make some attempt to try. So I have no doubt that I've offended one or two of you with that idea, but I do think that, as James Russell Lowell said in the 19th century, new occasions teach new duties. We're in a world where protecting the places that we love means thinking in larger terms than we've thought in the past, and adjusting our aesthetic enough to allow for some real shifts. I've come to think that a wind turbine is a beautiful thing, spinning in the breeze on the mountain ridge. I don't think we need them on every mountain ridge, and I don't think we should put them in wilderness areas. But I think when we have a place like Barton Mines, it already had roads and already had power lines, it would have been and remains an extremely smart idea to take advantage of those opportunities. Let me just end by saying, I cannot promise you that even if we do everything right at this point, we're going to catch up with this problem. There are scientists who think we've waited too long already. And there have been scary studies even in the last 18 months about what's going on, say, with the Gulf Stream, the big Atlantic currents, as we melt Greenland and pour huge amounts of fresh water into the ocean. But the best science indicates that we have a very narrow window that is closing, but still real, to allow us to make significant shifts, to allow us to pour a lot less carbon into the air. And in the process, I think, if we make this transition to energy from the sun, to energy from heaven instead of from hell, then there are other things that come with that too. One of them is that we're no longer as beholden to the political forces that gain their power from the fact that they control the scarce reserves of fossil fuel on this earth, power that they can, in essence, hoard. The fossil fuel industry put $500 million into the last election. And that's because they understand the threat and because they understand the need to protect what they have from change. But in a world that ran on sun and wind available everywhere, nobody would have, at least from the world of energy, quite that kind of money to spend. There wouldn't be a Vladimir Putin of the sun or the wind, or a Saudi royal family of the sun or the wind, you know? I think that would be extremely liberating and begin to break up some of the hierarchies that so daunt our society at the moment. I also think that there's something beautiful about the idea of beginning once again to pay some attention to the most visible object in our universe, that local star that already provides us with light and warmth and photosynthesis and is willing to provide us with all the power that we could ever want. We don't pay much attention to it. We sort of take it for granted. But I was moved last spring when across this region we had that remarkable eclipse. And for a day, people in lots and lots and lots of places stopped what they were doing and looked up, reconnected with the most significant object in our natural world. I was on the quad at Middlebury College with 1,500 students, and what do you know? They put down their phones for 20 minutes and watched this completely remarkable thing happen. And I know the same was true across the North Country, and it was a happy and powerful day. And that kind of reconnection strikes me as a beautiful thing too. So that's pretty much where we stand. I know it's not great news, and I apologize for adding to whatever psychic burden people are already carrying, because this is a time of extraordinary difficulty. But I also hope that I've given you at least a sense of where one escape hatch might be that we could, if we really worked, get at. And I'm going to ask you to do that work, especially as we approach this Sunday gathering. I hope there'll be some beautiful events across the Adirondacks. I remember the very first day of global action that we did on climate change. One of the first and most beautiful pictures that came in was a big group of people rallying on top of St. Regis Mountain. We're going to need that kind of spirit, and we're going to need it in spades come September and come the years ahead. So many, many thanks, y'all, for bearing with me. And if we've got a few questions, I'll try and answer them. And if we don't, then we can release you to go back into this gorgeous night and walk the dog and feel the snow on your hair or lack of hair. Do we have any questions there, Tracy, that you can tell? I can't hear you. I think you're muted, Tracy. I do see one question that's appeared somehow mysteriously in the chat. And it says, should we consider active forest management for forest fires? Probably not in this, at our latitude. I don't think there's much, fire is not really a normal part of our fire ecosystem here. The only big fires we've had in the past were the ones that accompanied the massive logging and of the late 19th and early 20th century, and they were often sparked by embers from the logging railroads falling on the vast piles of slash. But there are other parts of the country and the world where happily we're rediscovering the indigenous traditions around forest management through low intensity fire. And it's often being led by indigenous communities. I've been writing a good deal about that. And you can find some of it in the piece I did for the New Yorker or in a forthcoming book of mine called Here Comes the Sun, that'll be out later this year. And those are very beautiful experiments or very beautiful projects. I think that if everything went according to my plan, those would be the last big fires left burning on this earth, would be those ones set and managed by indigenous communities to control the possibility of flame, of out of control wildfire in the areas, arid areas that humans need to inhabit.
Okay, can everyone hear me? I've
We're
got
back. Yes, I
a
can hear
lot
you.
of questions now.
All right.
So let's see. Are there any new solutions from Green Mountain Power that will translate to upstate New York? Working families need to help make the transition to clean energy.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things, Green Mountain Power really is among the better utilities in the country. And one of the things that they've really done a lot of, and that I've written about for the New Yorker, and again, I'm writing about in this new book, is allow people to very cheaply or for free lease to own batteries for their homes. Often people who have solar panels, but sometimes people who don't. And those batteries are obviously good backup for when the power goes out. But the reason that they do this is so that they can control those batteries at certain critical times. And operate what they would call a virtual power plant. They can draw, in fact, in Vermont now, the single biggest power plant is this collection strung together of 3,500 or 4,000 batteries in people's basements and garages that can be dispatched centrally through the smart meters to provide power at peak moments. And actually, Green Mountain Power can dispatch, can do things like change the timing in the course of a important day with a huge heat wave or cold snap, change the timing of when your hot water heater is heating and things like that, so that they can distribute the load more effectively around the day. It's been a huge help. And these virtual power plant ideas are spreading and spreading rapidly. Texas is now building the biggest of them. Google, with their Nest thermostats, is putting together a sort of big project. So more of it, let's hope.
How do you figure out allocating your aid, your energy and resources between the big activist groups that speak to the powerful and the local entities doing grassroots work?
It's a good question. And I guess the answer is we probably need some of both. What we've tried to do at Third Act is sort of mix them. We have working groups in all 50 states. And since New York's so big, we've allowed New York to have a downstate and an upstate chapter. And they're doing extraordinary work responding to local things and building real power in Albany. And at the same time, they're very much together with the rest of us nationally when we have big pushes like this Sunday thing. So it seems to be a very good model that straddles that difference, and it's an important difference. So if you know anybody over the age of 60, uh, or if you don't, if you're not, just tell your grandparents, um, we're having a good deal of fun.
I've heard nothing about nuclear power. Does that have a future?
Depends how much money you have. Nuclear power is low carbon. So in that sense, it's useful here, but it's very high capital. We can generate power from the sun and the wind for 3, 4, 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And nuclear power is 2, 3 times that. And it takes 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times as long to build. If we're going to, for instance, significantly reduce emissions by 2030, it's not going to be by building nuclear power plants, because we're going to build exactly 0 nuclear power plants between now and 2030. It takes a lot longer than that. On the other hand, you can put up a solar farm in a matter of months. Um, um, I think it's possible that over time we'll figure out how to build small modular reactors. We shall see. Friends of mine like Jim Hansen think that that will happen. And it's possible that someday, though I don't think I'll be around to see it, we'll have workable and affordable fusion reactors. But for the meantime, if you really like the idea of nuclear power, content yourself with the idea that a solar panel is just a way of connecting to an extremely large nuclear reactor that just happens to be 93 million miles away in the sky.
Uh, Given the events of the last 10 days, do we need to imagine a more confrontational activism, or should we stay focused on advancing the positive, that is, the energy programs you have been advocating?
Well, it's a very good question that I don't really know the answer to. I think the answer in some ways depends on what we can do. I don't think that there's probably much that we can do by confrontation at the moment, though people are trying to figure some of that out. We had a good call last night, a national call at Third Act, um, uh, sponsored by our sort of nonviolent action working group. And they had me interviewing a really interesting fellow who'd helped lead the unrest against the Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic 25 years ago. And he was sort of trying to educate us on what you could and couldn't do in a more authoritarian environment. And what he said was that the traditional forms of sort of American civil disobedience and things don't really work against adversaries for whom cruelty is a feature, not a bug. And that instead we're going to need to think more creatively. And I think things like Sunday are a way of taking that resistance and turning it into, I mean, the job is to look for places where your opponents are vulnerable. And the place where these guys are vulnerable around climate is not at the moment in their political power. It's their political power is pretty absolute. They own Congress, the White House, and too much of the court system. The place where they're vulnerable is the fact that they're producing a dangerous product that's more expensive than the alternative. And and so that's what I think the place where we may be best poised to uh, 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 do do some damage. That said, uh, I think that in many cases we are going to have to try and figure out at least how to defend the most vulnerable people on this planet, in this country, be they immigrants who are at work in the fields of Lake Champlain, be they trans kids who are under now just kind of hideous assault. We were announcing apparently tonight plans for a 30,000 bed concentration camp in Guantanamo Bay for somebody. So, frankly, I don't know exactly how we're going to come to the defense of vulnerable people who need it, but I think we're clearly called to do some of that.
A question about wind turbines and solar farms, and do they do any
They do
harm
to-
to the animals who use that
Yes,
habitat?
good question. So the good news is that we're finding in lots of places that it's much less of a problem than we would have thought. There's been a lot of work done in the last few years about these exact questions. And some of it on animals. We're seeing that solar farms, for instance, established in agricultural areas, are highly compatible with continuing agriculture. Agrivoltaics is what people call it. And in some cases, those are extremely beautiful operations. The best field trip I took all last year was up into northern parts of Vermont with a pair of people who've set up a nonprofit here in this state that maintains about 20 largest solar farms with pollinator-friendly plantings between the rows of panels. And they've managed to increase the pollinator native insect diversity by astonishing numbers, 20, 40, 50 times as many insects per acre. We're used to thinking of things like a cornfield as natural, but really it's if you're growing corn along the edges of Lake Champlain, you've got a you've got a field of solar panels. They're just inefficient ones that you have to pour a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus on to make them grow. And that's the stuff that leaks into the lake. The corn isn't really all that necessary. We've got an oversupply of the milk that it's mostly used to generate. The thing we need is clean electrons. And so I think I hope, for instance, that here in Addison County, people will decide to approve plans for a big couple of 100-acre solar farm down in Panton near the lake. And I hope some of the same things will happen on the New York side too, going forward. I think that our aesthetic sense is going to have to change, but we do not have to cover every inch. In fact, most inches we don't have to cover. And in part, that's because solar panels are highly efficient. Let me give you an example. Corn, again, is our biggest crop in this country. Um, but about 40% of it is just turned into gasoline, ethanol. And that's an extremely inefficient process. I was with a friend in Illinois who was building some solar farms this summer, and he took me out in his Ford F-150 Lightning, the electric version of the most popular vehicle in the country. And we were standing on the edge of a 1-acre patch of solar panels. And he said, if this was in corn as it used to be, and it was made into ethanol as it used to be, that would produce enough ethanol to drive a Ford F-150 about 25,000 miles. But covered in solar panels, that same acre would produce enough electrons to drive the electric version of the F-150, not 25,000 miles, but 550,000 miles. Our sense of our landscape is somewhat askew. The other thing to be said about this is there's also an extraordinary amount of study of what climate change is going to do to the animals who inhabit our planet. And what it's going to do is wipe them out. We are on the edge of what scientists are calling the 6th great extinction. And if we're not able to control this rise in temperature, then it's going to be a bad century to be a plant or animal.
How beneficial is a significant shift to electric vehicles at this time? Are there new technologies for transportation that have fewer environmental downsides than lithium batteries?
Yeah, so first of all, the shift to EVs is useful and important. If you don't need one, an e-bike is an even better thing. They're really amazing and incredibly elegant. I mean, a bicycle is elegant already, but an e-bike is it's just a bicycle without hills, so it's quite remarkable. But, I would not worry endlessly about lithium batteries. We are figuring out new materials to make batteries with, and there are now electric vehicles, at least in China, that use sodium as the uh, main catalyst in the battery. But even lithium, if we have to go mine some, think about the difference from our current situation for a minute. If you go mine some lithium and put it in a battery, it stays there for 25 years doing its job. And then when its battery begins to degrade, we now are able to recycle that. Lithium is valuable enough that we're able to recycle it already and get almost all of it back. Whereas if you go mine some coal, you set it on fire, and then you have to go back and mine some more the next day. So there was a new paper this summer from the Rocky Mountain Institute um, that that demonstrated that the amount of critical minerals like lithium that need to be mined between now and 2050 to have this green energy transition, the volume of those minerals is less altogether than the volume of coal that was mined last year on this earth. Okay. A way to think about this is that 40% of all the ship traffic on planet Earth is just carrying coal and gas and oil back and forth around the planet to be burned. We don't need to do that since the sun happily moves back and forth across the planet every day. But that should give you some sense of the scale. So I would not obsess about the minerals required here. They're available. We should mine them as environmentally and humanely as possible. But none of that damage comes close to comparing to what we do to the earth as we burn fossil fuels.
Do Adirondack rivers have more hydropower potential than is currently being tapped to help get at this challenge?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that precisely. There's obviously rivers we don't want to dam. It would be uh, absurd to dam the Hudson at the gorge, for instance, for hydropower. It's not its highest use. Um, but my guess is that there's probably some what we call low head hydro to be uh, done, run of river hydro projects and things. But I don't think that I don't know the exact numbers here, but my guess is that most of the good hydro potential in the park that we would want to exploit is already exploited.
Okay. And how critical is significant new grid transmission capacity?
Important across the country, and we need to be able to move power from where it's easily produced to where it's most needed. So some of that's big intercontinental transmission facilities. Some of it's smaller and more regional. And we also need to be getting better at producing power that's quite local and stays there, including at the level, as I said before, of the average of the single house or building, where it's the main expense now is just these soft costs of permitting and so on that we should be able to reduce dramatically as they have in most of the rest of the world. So at every level, we can reduce the bureaucratic log jams that get in the way.
Okay. And how can AI be a positive for the environment despite its need for significant power resources?
I'm the wrong person to answer. It seems to me that normal intelligence, natural intelligence, has produced the answers that we need. That's what's given us solar panels that are cheap, wind power that's cheap, and batteries that are cheap. Maybe AI will be able to help people make the next generations of these things cheaper still, but they're cheap enough now. Um, Truthfully, I think AI at the moment is a real threat um, because the fossil fuel industry is using it as its latest excuse for trying to build more gas-fired power plants. That's why I was happy to see, as I wrote about in my newsletter today, um, the advent of this Chinese DeepSeek AI program 2 days ago, which seems to imagine a future where AI, if we have to use it, is far less resource intense than the models being developed by our wonderful tech oligarchs. When Donald Trump declared an energy emergency on day one, it was ostensibly in order to provide more power to AI to beat the Chinese for whatever reason it is we want to beat the Chinese. But it seems like the Chinese are doing okay at figuring out how to do this. And in fact, our this new AI program they've come up with is open source and people can go get it. So I'm sort of the wrong person to ask in some ways, but I very much hope that if we're going to engage in this project, we do it in ways that don't use massive amounts more energy, because it's going to be hard enough freeing up clean energy to heat our homes and drive our cars and things.
Okay, well, I think this will be the last question and a nice way to end. What can individuals do between now and Sunday?
Well, pretty soon you can start organizing for Sunday, and within 6 weeks or so, we'll have stuff out and people will start. And then I hope people will use it as a way over the intervening months to talk with local officials about things like permitting and so on. It should be easy and simple to put up a solar panel, to put a battery in your basement. It shouldn't be an expensive and time-consuming procedure. In Germany in the last year, people have put about 1.5 million Germans have put what they call balcony solar on their apartments. They can just go there to IKEA and buy a solar panel and hang it from the banister of their balcony. And in many cases, they're producing 20% of the power they use. You can't do that in this country. For the most part, it would require too many permits and be too expensive, even though, this is basically safe technology. Look, we live in a country where you're allowed to own a machine gun, and nobody says boo if you chain together 18 space heaters in your house, and you're allowed to drive a vehicle the size of a Greyhound bus to get your groceries. So the thought that we can't have your solar panel hanging off your balcony seems anachronistic. Those are the kind of things that would be good to be working on. We also need you working hard, and this is why Third Act Upstate New York is so useful, on the things that need to happen in Albany. Governor Hochul seems to take an extraordinary amount of blocking and tackling before you can get anything done. But if you do enough of it, sometimes you win. That's how we got that polluter pays bill through. And that's how people finally got congestion pricing through in Manhattan. And the accounts that I've been hearing from people in Manhattan in the first couple of weeks are that it's very much changed the character of Lower Manhattan. I can't wait to get down and wander around a much less car-clogged island. So we have lots of other things that have to get done in Albany, and being able to get things done in Albany is a big deal. And the North Country obviously is politically overrepresented, is a powerful place. There's only 100,000 of us or whatever up in the park, but we have extraordinary sway over what happens there, much outsized influence. So this is a great opportunity to make big things happen. And the people at Third Act Upstate New York are very good at that.
Well, Bill, thank you very much. We had so many questions and still couldn't stump you. You really know this topic better than anybody. So we're
very good to get
grateful.
to talk with you all. And the only thing I'll end where I began by saying, whatever else you're doing, make sure you get out and enjoy this winter, because no guarantee we'll ever see another winter quite like it. It's been extraordinarily beautiful, and trust you me, along with trying to save the world and prevent fascism and everything else, I've made sure to be out on my skis every morning for at least a little while. So you should too.
Yeah.
Take care, y'all.
Amen. Thank you, Bill. And thank you to all of you again for your support of the Explorer. Good night.